Hey there, welcome to LSAT Demon Daily. I'm Brandon McDole, that's Kaley Danks. We're two teachers with the LSAT Demon. I teach a class called Demon Foundations on Sunday evenings. It's an intro class, so we start from day one, what's your first day of study look like, and we go through all the skills that we at the Demon find most important. Kaley, what about you? What classes do you teach?
I teach every day at noon Eastern a lunch class. It's designed to fit in your lunch break, going over a couple LR questions. And then I also teach on Wednesday afternoon, early evening, a Reading Comp Foundations class. So how to get started with Reading Comp, really building those foundational skills.
Yeah, so we got together today. We were talking. We've noticed a lot of things that students struggle with on RC. And we kind of want to just hop on the podcast and talk about some things we're noticing, give some advice on, one, how to start with RC, and then how to break through those difficulties and those misunderstandings. So I want to ask Kaley, what do you tell students to do on day one? Like, what's your advice? What's your approach when you're starting with a student who has never done RC before?
Biggest thing is take it intuitively. I feel like we look at RC and we want to use those fourth grade reading comprehension tactics that we have, but we need to learn to just take it as the LSAT gives it to us. We're not supposed to read the questions beforehand or do any of that. Just read the passage super intuitively. Make sure you're understanding it as you're reading. And biggest thing to focus on is understand what you're reading and be able to remember what you're reading. So then when you get to the questions, you'll be good to go. And it really isn't that difficult to figure out what the question is asking, remember what the passage said about it, and then go from there.
Yeah, I totally agree with that intuitive approach. I think I notice a lot of students, especially with science passages, things like that, they think they won't be able to reason it out. And then they kind of give up before they even try. So, but if you tell yourself like, if I just sit with this, if I just kind of think it through, use my intuition, like you said, you will be able to figure it out. And I agree. I tell students, like, I like how you pointed out, the difference between LSAT reading and maybe some other reading. The first thing I tell students is I think you have to practice, focusing on each sentence carefully, right? I think so much in our lives, we just kind of skim through stuff. We read it quickly. We're almost incentivized to read fast, right? And with the LSAT, that's the opposite of what you want to do. You want to just read carefully, read each sentence with your full focus. Like, I felt like I had to practice that, right? I felt like I had to practice not zoning out, not thinking about other stuff. And then the next thing I focus on is main point. So we were just talking about this on our messaging and stuff with the main point. So what are some things you've noticed with helping students identify the main point, and what's some advice you give for that?
The biggest thing that I tell students is don't wait until you get to the main point question to figure out what the main point is. The main point, and it's kind of a given that every passage is going to ask you about the main point in one way or another. It might not ask you explicitly, what's the main point of this passage? But the questions are going to be framed in a way that you have to know the main point. And so figure it out before you even get to the questions. I feel like a lot of students don't put enough time into predicting and really figuring that out. So the first thing I tell them is figure out what that is. As soon as you're done reading the passage, you need to make sure you explicitly say, this is the main point in your head as you're, if you're taking the test out loud, if you want, if you're not taking the test, really figure out what it is. And then that can help guide you through all the questions as you do them.
Yeah. Oh, totally. I agree. I tell students, physically pause and stop when you get done reading before you go to that first question. Like we always talk about doing the work up front. Same thing we talk about predictions and everything. If you take that extra 30 seconds, then that's going to save you so much hassle and everything. I also liked how you talked about how, the main point applies to all the questions in some way, shape, or form. I think students forget even on questions that aren't main point questions, you can still use the main point to help you eliminate answers, to help you figure out what's going on. I think I'd go so far as to say, I think basically every single question you can rely on that main point in some way, shape, or form. You always want that to be your starting point, right? I mean, maybe I'd change that a little bit, if it's like a different point of view question. In that sense, it's like, okay, maybe if it's this person's point of view, we're going against the main point or something like that. But yeah, totally.
Yeah, I think that students fail to grasp how important it is and how much it applies to really everything, all the questions, just like you were saying. If there is a question that asks, what would the author, the author would agree with which one of the following statements? Well, what is the author saying? What's the author's main point of the passage? Therein, you know the author's opinion. You can figure out the purpose of why the author wrote the passage, and it's really not hard to answer the question. The wrong answers are going to be ones that won't align with how the author thinks, why the author wrote the passage, and you'll stumble upon the right answer and be like, oh yeah, that follows from what I know about the main point.
Yeah, totally. Exactly. And I think that's a great example, like you talked about, author's point of view. Well, if you know the main point, that's the author's point of view, more or less, right? And so you're just going along with that. You were talking about, I think ways students struggle to identify the main point. What's some things you've noticed that maybe holds them back and makes it difficult for them?
The biggest thing that students do is they feel like the main point has to be all encompassing. Like we have to talk about, like the main point is a summary of what each paragraph talked about. And that's exactly what it is, a summary. That's not the main point. And so when we're formulating main point, especially as we're working on our predictions, I always caution students, don't just think about what the passage said. Think about what's the overall message. Maybe the first paragraph isn't necessarily part of that main point, but helps us get to the author's main point. It's background for the main point. So we don't have to include the first paragraph in our prediction. We just have to make sure we're encapsulating what does the author want us to learn. So I often see that, students want to make a summary of the whole passage as their main point, or they just make their main point prediction way too long. The author's not out here writing an essay for their main point. We need to be quick and concise because that's how the answer choices are going to be when we get to that main point question.
No, yeah, exactly. So in my RC classes, I've started having students DM me the main point, and that's the number one feedback I give is make it shorter. Oftentimes they'll have the main point in there, but then they feel this need to include, okay, so the author's against fracking, and also they're against fracking because of, the Geneva Convention or whatever, and also it's like they're giving the examples and the details. You don't need any of that. You're not a exact rule, but I tell students to push themselves to keep it to 10 words or less, right? Because like we were just saying a second ago too, you want to be able to remember it easily. It doesn't need to be long. It's actually not meant to be long. If you think about it, the answer choices on a main point question are typically 10 words or around there, maybe 10 to 15, right? So, set that kind of standard for yourself too, because then you're going to remember it. You're not going to have to be constantly like thinking about, oh, what was the main point again? And then you're going to be able to use it like we were just talking about. So yeah, that's, I think, the biggest thing I notice. I'm always having them like cut that in half.
Right. Well, so what do you do when students are like, but I don't know how to make it shorter. I know you say, 10 words or less, but how do we get to that point that it's like we can actually make a 10 word or less main point prediction?
That's a great question. So I like with everything else we talk about, I think it's a skill. View it as something you need to practice and work on, right? But in my classes, I'm able to take their own words and be like, okay, you have this. That's all you need to say. Cut the second half. So the most common advice I'm giving is I just take their own words and I chop off half of it and send it back to them and be like, hey, this is all you needed to say. You don't need to add this extra stuff on there. So that would be, if you're trying to self-reflect and do that, that would be the first thing I'd say is if you understood the passage and you're able to articulate what the passage is about, in a way, the first 10 words you say, that's probably all you need. The author is against fracking. And that's might be all we need. We might just need to say like, okay, if it's like a pro-con type essay, that's all we need is like the author is against this thing or the author is for this thing. And that's going to be enough, right? There's only, if that's the main point, there's 99% of the time, there's only going to be one answer that's even close to that, I feel like. We were talking too about how do you go through the wrong answers on a main point question. I describe it like a Goldilocks thing, like there's always one answer that's too specific, almost always one answer that's too specific, almost one answer that's too general, and then, one or two that are just not related or wrong, and then you're kind of looking for that one that's just the right amount of general, just the right amount of specific. It's about the passage, it encompasses the whole passage. It's not some one specific fact, and it's not this broad, all-encompassing thing beyond what the author talked about. Do you have any things that you add to that? Anything to add to that about, how to eliminate the wrong answers and go through that part?
Yeah, I love the Goldilocks rule. I'm going to take that and use that in my classes. Don't worry, I will give you the credit. So it's along those same lines. What I tend to tell my students is there's typically 3 reasons that an answer choice for the main point question will be wrong. And if you have any one of those reasons in an answer choice, you can just immediately cross it off. And that's, it's going to have information from outside of the passage. Obviously, if it starts talking about things that weren't even in the passage, that can't be the main point of the passage. Another thing is if it's way too specific, like if it only talks about one of the points that the passage brought up, that's just not the main point typically. If it's, if it's too specific. The other thing is maybe it does have facts from the passage, but it gets them wrong. Like in your fracking example, it might say the main point is like fracking is good, which we know is false based on the passage and the evidence that the author presented to us. So if you have any of those 3 reasons in a main point answer choice, you can just immediately get rid of it because the correct answer will be broad enough. It will have all the right information from the passage, and it's not going to include any outside information. That's a great way to, test your prediction and test the answer choices too.
Definitely. I like those rules too. I'll also steal that and use that and give you credit. I think that's, really helpful. So I guess anything else you'd add about RC main points?
I think the biggest thing that I want students to do is just we said at the top of this podcast, I'll reiterate it again, make sure that you are formulating those main points. You can do that as you read, look for the main point as you read. And then when you're finished with the passage, really make sure you have a solid understanding of the main point. This is going to help you in the main point question, in the rest of the questions as well. That's step 1 to any reading comp passage. As soon as you're done reading it, make sure you know the main point. Take the time, be disciplined, sit down and really figure out what it's saying.
I agree. Take Kaley's advice, everybody. Find the main point. Don't rush in the questions. I want a last piece of advice. I think if you're having difficulty doing what Kaley just said, if you're finding that you're trying that and it's not working out, I really recommend watching the videos of Ben and Nathan or the other teachers reading the passage, right? It's, you read it yourself, maybe do the questions, and then if you get a bunch of questions wrong or you miss the main point, go back and watch the video of them reading the passage. And that helped me a lot as a student, and I think it'll help you too with all this stuff we're talking about, how do you go about identifying it? How do you focus on the right things? Cool. Sounds good?
Sounds
good. Should we wrap it up there?
Let's do it.
Thanks everybody for listening. Email daily@lsatdemon.com if you'd like to ask this question or share some LSAT or law school admissions news. Thanks for listening.